My name is Jared Brook, and I'm an Extension Wildlife Specialist with Purdue University. And we're here tonight to talk about how to create quality habitat for a variety of wildlife species on your property. So we're going to be talking about establishing native grasses and forbs for wildlife. And so we normally do these face to face. We do a lot of face to face events with landowners and others, trying to help answer questions they may have or provide some advice. Um, but with the current situation, we're not able to do face-to-face stuff, so we figured we'd try to bring the help to you and answer questions you might have. So this is really going to be a question and answer session. So I have some questions that people have left for me on social media, so I'll address those. But as you have more questions, things come up, feel free to ask them away in the comment box, and I'll try to answer them as they come about. And so what we're here to talk about today is establishing native grasses and forbs for wildlife. But actually what we're going to talk about is how to create quality early successional plant communities for wildlife. And that's a big word, early successional plant communities. The easiest way to think about this is think about old fields, think about conservation reserve program plantings, think about prairies and grassland. Those are all early successional plant communities. To understand that, we need to talk about one term, which is plant succession. So you got to think back to your high school biology and high school and college biology days and think about plant succession. So plant succession is just the orderly change in the plant community over time. So if we think about, I'm sure we've all seen a crop field that's been harvested but then didn't get planted. Maybe it was too wet, they didn't plant it. But just because a crop field doesn't get planted doesn't mean that there won't be any plants that come up in that field. And if we were to leave a crop field unplanted for 40 or 50 years, eventually that crop field would turn into a forest. But all along the way, it's going to change in the plant species that are there. So it's going to start out with some weeds that we might see, things like foxtail, annuals, foxtail, common ragweed, things like that. And then it's going to advance as new seed comes in and germinates. It's going to get some perennial grasses and forbs in it. And then it's going to get things like blackberries and shrubs. And eventually trees are going to take over the site. And eventually, later on down the road, it's going to end up being a forest. So when we talk about early successional plant communities, we're talking about those first probably 1 to 5 or 6 years after the field goes fallow and it isn't planted anymore. And so you're talking about things like your annual and perennial grasses and weeds, what we call forbs or wildflowers. Those are the ones that are dominant on the site. But the reason those are important for wildlife is there's a whole suite of wildlife species that use those areas as their habitat. And so these areas provide food, cover, water, and all kinds of things to various wildlife species. And a lot of those wildlife species are the wildlife species that are the most in need of help and most in need of more habitat. So you think about our grassland wildlife species, a lot of our grassland songbirds like Henslow sparrows, grasshopper sparrows, eastern meadowlarks, they've declined a lot in the past 40 or 50 years. And a lot of that's due to habitat loss and a loss of these early successional plant communities, these old fields. So when we talk about early successional plant communities, we're going to use the term old field or native grass or CRP planting. Those are essentially what they are. It's an easier way to think about it. But even species like deer and turkey use these areas. Deer will use them heavily to bed in. There's also a lot of food that's available to deer in these sites. But the most important thing they provide for deer is a place for fawns, a place for fawns to be protected from predators and from weather and other things. So it's an important area and vegetation type for a lot of wildlife species. And then things like that might have been common in the past but aren't so common anymore will be things like northern bobwhite, quail, and such. All those species are going to use these old fields, and they provide really good habitat for a lot of those species. So it's important to have these areas on the landscape to provide habitat for these species. And a lot of wildlife species, or a lot of programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and even the Environmental Quality Incentive Programs and some state level programs through the DNR are available to help landowners create these old fields, these CRP plantings, and early successional plant communities to help a variety of different wildlife species. So that's what we're here to talk about today. So if you have questions, feel free to ask away as we go. But if we don't have questions at the moment, we will we will go with some questions that we got from social media beforehand. So the first one we're going to talk about is what are some of the important things to think about before planting native grasses and forbs for wildlife? That's a good question. It'll get us kind of right into the meat of our topic tonight. But one of the first things you need to think about is what are your objectives? So what are you hoping to create? What kind of wildlife species are you hoping to provide habitat for by planting native grasses and forbs? And then also, what are your other goals? You may have other goals besides wildlife. You may be interested in planting some of these sites to provide food for cattle, to provide erosion control. Maybe pollinators is important. But understanding those objectives will help you make decisions throughout the process and along the way. So identifying what those objectives are is really important, and even could be just specific wildlife species. So if you have a specific wildlife species you're interested in, maybe you're really interested in providing habitat for bobwhite quail on your property, the decisions you make in the process may be different than if you were interested in managing for grassland songbirds or something else. So it's important to think about those objectives. That's kind of the tip number one, first thing you need to think. And then the next thing to think about is, do we even need to plant to meet those objectives? There's a lot of cases where we may not need to plant. We may actually be able to use the seeds that are already in the soil, in the seed bank, to provide the habitat that we need to provide for whatever wildlife species we're interested in or whatever goal we're trying to achieve. And we'll get into that more in a little bit with another question we have. But that's an important thing to consider as well, is what are those objectives, and do we need to plant to reach those objectives? So once we've decided that maybe planting is the thing that we need to do, we need to think about, what does our site look like? What are the soils on the site? Soils is an important consideration when we're thinking about establishing native grasses and forbs, because each plant species has its niche, and you're going to have species that do well on poorly drained soils, so wetter soils, and you're going to have species that do well on drier sites. So picking the right species for the right site is also really important. Just some tips on thinking about seed mix design we'll get into here in a minute. But beyond seed mix design, you also need to think about how you're going to prepare the site. So what's already existing in the site, what kind of vegetation, and how are you going to control that vegetation to get the best prepared site to establish and plant these native grasses and forbs. And so things to think about there are kind of the best case scenario would be to plant into a harvested soybean field or harvested corn field, soybean being better because there's not as much litter in the field, but having that harvested soybean field is going to be beneficial because you're going to not have as much litter and residue on the top of the ground to deal with, but you're also going to have a lot of really good weed control coming out of that agricultural production. So you may have to do less weed control prior to planting if you've already had that weed control from a soybean field. If you're trying to convert an old pasture like a fescue field or a brome field, which are two non-native exotic grasses, then you're going to think about, what kind of herbicide can I apply to get rid of that existing vegetation so it doesn't outcompete the vegetation that I planted. Next, you're going to think about, once you've done site prep, you're going to think about, how am I actually going to establish this vegetation, whether it's through drilling, that's one method, so using a no-till seed drill, or whether it's through broadcasting the seed on top of the ground. Those are two of the most common methods that you could use to establish native warm season grasses. And we'll get in, there's another question about that here in a minute that we'll kind of dive into that in detail. And then you're also going to think about the timing of establishment. So what time of year are you going to establish? Is it going to be during the dormant season, kind of that November to March time frame, or is it going to be during the growing season, that April to June time frame? So those are all things to think about when you're deciding whether or not you should plant native grasses in forests for wildlife. So a lot of things to consider, but important things to think about before you plant. So we got a question in here from Rebecca, and the question is, on a smaller scale, could someone plant these in a backyard for birds? And can you plant over drainage systems behind septics in wetter areas? So the short answer to that question is yes, for both of those. There's a lot of really good resources related to establishing and having native plants in your backyard for wildlife. And there was just an article I read earlier that talked about those native plantings being better for a lot of our bird species than some of our non-native type landscaping plants. So having those native plants in there can be really important. You can find a lot of resources around incorporating native plants into your existing landscaping or native plant gardening. And can they be planted over septic systems or drainages in wetter areas? Absolutely. You just need to think about what species can tolerate those wetter sites. So looking at some of the species and make sure that they can thrive in wetter areas is an important consideration. So you're going to find a lot of species that do well in wetter areas. Some species won't. So just matching the plant species to the site conditions. And when it comes to planting on a smaller scale, like a backyard or landscaping, a lot of times using plugs you can get from a nursery, a native nursery, is better than seed. It's more effective and efficient. But on a larger scale, using plugs gets really expensive and not very efficient. So thanks for the question, Becca. And now we're going to go to our next question. So this one was submitted through social media as well. And it's, what is the best way to convert a cool season grass pasture back to quality habitat, native grasses, and forbs? This is a really good question. I get this question a lot, and I deal with a lot of pasture conversions. So when we think about pasture conversions, most of the pastures that we have in Indiana are cool season exotic grasses. And those are typically, some of the big ones would be things like tall fescue, timothy, orchard grass, smooth brome, and Kentucky bluegrass. You can add a few more in there as well. But most of those grasses do not provide a lot of quality habitat for a lot of wildlife species because of the way they grow. So they grow more like a carpet, more like our turf grasses we would see in our yards. So it's really hard for small wildlife species that live on the ground, especially things like bobwhite quail, even rabbits and others, to actually be able to move through those cool season exotic grasses and find food effectively. So pick up insects and seed off the ground. So it's generally best, if we're interested in wildlife, is to convert those cool season grass pastures into some sort of native vegetation. And there's a couple different options we have to do that. And one of my favorite ways to do it, and one that I think is really effective, it's also very cost effective, is to do what we call native revegetation or spray and walk away. And so there's the opportunity that you can kill those cool season exotic grasses with some sort of herbicide application. Generally, it's a Roundup application that's done in mid to late October to mid-November, when the cool season grasses are actively growing, but our warm season grasses have gone dormant. You can effectively kill those cool season grasses without having a lot of impact on non-target vegetation, stuff you don't want to kill. And it's also to think about coming back in the spring with another follow-up application of herbicide to control those cool season grasses. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow the seeds in the seed bank. It's going to give them room to grow. So seeds that are in the soil that have been waiting to germinate, it's going to give them a chance to germinate. And you'll find a lot of native species and a lot of, and sometimes non-native species you'll find in the seed bank once you get rid of that existing vegetation and allow that seed bank to respond. And a lot of people may do that and look at it and say, man, there's just a bunch of weeds out here. And that's really the point, right? We want the weeds. So a weed is just the wrong plant in the wrong place, the wrong time to the wrong person. So what a cattle farmer or a row crop farmer might call a weed, from a wildlife standpoint, is actually probably really good. And the case in point is common ragweed. So common ragweed, if you have hay fever, it can be an absolute nightmare, right? It causes all sorts of allergies. But from a wildlife standpoint, it's a commonly browsed species by deer, so deer really like to eat it. It's also a seed that's commonly eaten, and actually eaten a lot by things like northern bobwhite quail, mourning doves, pheasant, and a whole bunch of species. So the weeds that we would get back in those stands after killing that non-native cool season grasses, a lot of them are really good for wildlife. So you would get things back like broom sedge. And so broom sedge is a native warm season grass that we typically have in the southern part of the state. From a cattle standpoint, it's a terrible grass to have. From a wildlife standpoint, it can be a really good grass to have. It has really good structure. We're also going to get really good species back, like some of our common ragweed, common milkweed will come back a lot when you get rid of the cool season grasses. So everyone knows common milkweed is a really important plant for monarch butterflies. It's the host for their larvae. And we can get that from free seed from the seed bank by just removing that layer of cool season grasses and allowing the seed bank to respond. You're also going to get things like goldenrods, asters. So if you think about driving past a field in August or September and you see a bunch of white flowers out there, those are generally going to be most of our aster species. Those are really good. They provide really good structure for a lot of wildlife species. They're browsed commonly by deer. They also provide really good kind of late summer, early fall resources for pollinators. And that comes back from the seed bank without ever having to plant anything. You also get things like blackberries that comes back that produces really important soft mass for wildlife species. You're going to get desmodiums, which we call beggar's lice, the ones that stick to your legs. They can be kind of a nuisance, but they're also really important from a food standpoint for a lot of wildlife species. But you could potentially also get some species that you may not want in the site. And so those species would be things like Johnson grass, maybe some crabgrass, Sericea lesbideza, Canada thistle, some of those species that would be invasive. So when you're using this technique, again, that we're calling spray and walk away, where you remove the existing cool season grass to allow the seed bank to respond, you're going to want to control some of those invasive plants. Again, some of those would be things like Sericea lesbideza, Canada thistle, and Johnson grass and such. So, but you can do that effectively, and you can do that selectively with an herbicide application just by spot spraying those species out and allowing the seed bank to respond again with the good native species that you want. We do this a lot on old pastures, and it really works well. It's a lot cheaper than actually planting the species you want in the site. So it can be a really, really important tool to use to create quality old fields for a lot of wildlife species. So this is a really good one. It's one of the best ways to convert a pasture from cool season grass like tall fescue to native warm season grasses. The other way that we could do that is we could do the same thing by eliminating and killing the cool season grasses, and then we could come back after a year or two of weed control and plant native grasses and forbs in the site. So that's the other option. That's the option that a lot of people use. So we have kind of two different avenues that we could take. But I think there's a lot of value into just removing the plants that you don't want from the site to allow the native plants that are in the seed bank to respond. The next question we got is, what is the best mix of native grasses and forbs for wildlife? This is a good one. It's a hard one to answer on live because you need a lot more information to really decide. You really need to match your mix, so your native grass and forb mix, to your site. So based on your soils and your drainage and things like that, but also to your objectives, right? And so the mix that I would use to create habitat for northern bobwhite might be different from the mix that I would use to provide really high quality habitat for pollinators. Not to say that there's not overlap between them, but they're just different. And there might be a different cost associated with them and things like that. So those are some important things to think about when you decide what the best mix is to use. But there's some things to think about, some tips to think about as we go through seed mix design. So you want to make sure that you have a variety of different species represented in the seed mix. So you want to have some native grasses in there, as well as some forbs, both legumes and non-legumes. And we say forbs, those are generally just your wildflowers. We also want to make sure some of those forbs are annuals, biennials, and perennials too. So that's going to give you a really good diverse mix that's going to last a long time in the site. Some things you want to avoid. Generally, you want to avoid plantings that are nothing but native grasses, unless you have some sort of reason to use a strictly native grass mix. You generally want to avoid them because those aren't going to provide habitat for a variety of wildlife species. And usually after a couple years, they're going to be solid stands of native grasses, which we've learned through trial and error of these plantings doesn't provide a lot of habitat for things like bobwhite, pheasants, and others. So we want to have a good mix of grasses and forbs in the stand, in the seed mix. And a lot of times for most wildlife species, we may want to limit some of the tall grasses we have in the mix. So some of the tall grasses may be things like big blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. Not to say that you can't have those in there or you should completely avoid them, but you want to limit the amount of seed in the seed mix that's some of those tall grasses, unless you have a reason to include them or you're trying to add them to provide certain kind of structure or resource for various wildlife species. The reason you want to try to limit those seeds is because we've learned through previous plantings that if we add too much of that tall native grass seed in there, then over time, over a short time, 3 or 4 years, then those stands turn into nothing but grass. So nothing but tall native morasses and grasses. They shade out all the forbs and the wildflowers, so their value to a lot of wildlife species really diminishes. So you got to come back in and do some sort of management to increase the amount of wildflowers or forbs in the stand. And so that's just some things to think about. Really, the best piece of advice that I can give you is to talk to one of your local biologists, whether that's a district biologist through the Indiana DNR, or whether that's a biologist with Pheasants Forever or Quail Forever, or even some of our other organizations that help out, like your soil water conservation districts or the NRCS. They're going to be able to provide more site-specific information to provide you a better seed mix that's going to work on your site and work for the objectives and goals that you have. So after this, I'm going to post a few more resources that are good for people to think about and good for people to use when it comes to establishing native grasses and forbs. So we got another question too about what is better, to drill or frost seed native grasses and forbs. So again, I think it's worth mentioning that before you decide that you're going to plant, you need to think about, is planting necessary? A lot of times when we don't have to plant to reach our objectives to provide habitat for wildlife, and that's really important consideration. But if you decide that the seed bank's just very poor on your site and you're not getting the species back that you wanted and that are benefiting wildlife, then certainly planting is an option. And when we think about how we're actually going to establish it, we have a couple different ways we can do that. One of those is with a no-till seed drill. And the other way is that we can broadcast the seed on top of the ground. And we can do that with just a hand seed spreader on small sites, or we can do that with a broadcast seed spreader, which is more like a fertilizer cyclone spreader behind a tractor, an ATV, or a UTV. So two different kind of methods we can use. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. Drilling provides you better seed to soil contact. Some of the seed can be lost to rodents or birds, or lost to rot if you broadcast on top of the ground. But also we need to think about what time of year we're doing this. So they mentioned frost seeding. So frost seeding is kind of a specialized way to do it. And this is really taking advantage of the natural cycles of the freeze thaw and the soil wetting and drying to help you get that really good seed to soil contact, but also helping break the dormancy of a lot of our native forbs. So if you think about how a natural prairie works, in a natural prairie, a lot of the seed on the plants ripens and hardens in the late summer or early fall. Then it falls to the ground. It lays on the ground for over winter and then has the ability to germinate in the spring. So by frost seeding, we're taking advantage of that natural cycling of a prairie and of some of these grasslands, and we're allowing the seed coating to be worn down by the freezing thawing, so it helps germinate those seeds next spring. If you plant some species in the spring, some species of forbs, let's say in the May-June time frame, they may not actually germinate until the next growing season, so you have to wait a year to see them. But by doing frost seeding, we can actually help establish some of those native grasses, or some of those forbs, I apologize. So it can help lead to more wildflowers in the stand by doing the frost seeding. If we're going to plant in the spring, which is typically about April 15th to about June 15th, when the soil's at 55 degrees or above, then we need to think the best case scenario for that is to use a drill. That tends to give you the best results. A no-till drill that's specialized to plant native grasses. If you ever see the native grass seed, it's pretty fluffy, really light, has beards and different things on it, and so it can be really hard to plant. These native grass drills are specialized to plant these species. And you may be asking yourself, well, how can I get a native grass drill? Luckily, a lot of your local soil and water conservation districts, as well as a lot of Pheasants Forever or Quail Forever chapters, have native grass drills that can be rented to use. So they're really not too hard to get access to if you can contact your local soil and water conservation district or Pheasants or Quail Forever chapter. So those are best. Those no-till drills are best to use in the spring. You can also use them in the winter if you're frost seeding, but you may be limited by soil conditions at that point. But regardless of which method you choose, it's important to calibrate those drills. And when we talk about calibrating those pieces of equipment, we talk about calibrating, we're talking about making sure that those drills and those pieces of equipment are set up to put down the correct amount of seed per acre. And we have some videos on our extension website. I'll add some of those in there that you can use to help you calibrate those pieces of equipment. So that's a really important step in the calibration process. All right, so we just got another question in. The question we got was, if I want to draw in more turkeys and pheasants into pasture land, should I plant a specific type of native grass mix? So I'm not sure if you were listening earlier when we talked about this, but I imagine the pasture land you're talking about is a cool season pasture. And generally, from a turkey standpoint and a pheasant standpoint, if you can just get rid of that cool season grass layer, that fescue or brome or whatever it is, and allow the seed bank to respond, a lot of the seeds that come out of that seed bank are going to be really beneficial to pheasants and turkeys. They're going to be things that attract insects, that are going to provide a food source for turkeys, for turkey poults and pheasant broods in the summer. But also they're going to be species that produce a seed that especially pheasants are going to be eating in the fall and winter. So a lot of times the most effective, cheapest, and quickest way to improve a pasture land for wildlife is to just remove that layer of cool season grasses with an herbicide application. If you aren't getting the species back that you want, in that pasture, you can think about planting some sort of mix in there. And you don't necessarily have to think about planting a specific mix. There's a lot of mixes out there. But think about what kind of structure you want for pheasants and turkeys. And so what kind of plants you want out there, and that can help drive your species mix. So you want to make sure you have a mixture of grasses, but also a mixture of forbs in there too. Because those forbs or wildflowers, that's going to be what attracts the insects. That's also going to be what attracts the or produces the seed that those species are going to eat. They're going to use the grasses and things for nesting, and even some shrub cover, things like blackberry, and some brambles like blackberry, and shrubs like plum and others can be a really good thing to have in a pasture for turkeys, pheasants, bobwhite, and other species. If you're looking for a specific seed mix, I recommend you reach out to your local district biologist or pheasants forever biologist in your area, and they can provide a very site-specific mix for you and provide some more specific instructions that may be helpful to you. Thanks, Sean, for that question. All right, so the next question we got was, what is your go-to herbicide for pre- and post-emergent control of weeds in switchgrass stands? So generally we don't recommend to plant single species stands, but they can be used in certain situations. If you're interested in having native grasses around for cattle forage or producing hay, it can be important to have single species stands. They help with management. Sometimes if you're looking to maybe screen some areas or block some areas, say you want to block your property from the road, single species stands of switchgrass can be a good way to do that, because they typically stand really tall, and then they also stand all winter long. Some of the problems with the other tall native warm season grasses, like especially big blue stem, but Indian grass as well, is they look really thick and really good in June, July, August, September, and October. But as soon as we get that first snow in November or December, or even January, or it gets really wet, those grasses fall over and they lodge on the ground and they look almost flat. And that doesn't provide a lot of resources for a lot of wildlife species. So it's important that's why we talk about limiting those species in there so that the stand stands up all winter long. But if we're talking about herbicide for pre- and post-emergent control on switchgrass, there's a couple ones that you can use. There's a chemical called Outrider, is its brand name, and it can be used on established stands of switchgrass, or it can be used on seedling switchgrass if it has at least 3 leaves. There's a couple other ones too. There's a chemical called Paramount that can be used on established stands to control grass and broadleaf weeds. 2,4-D or triclopyr are both broadleaf herbicides, broadleaf selective herbicides, and they can be used on switchgrass without harming switchgrass. And then if you're trying to control cool season grasses in the dormant season, things like fescue and brome and that kind of thing in the switchgrass stand, then you can just use glyphosate after the switchgrass has gone dormant, about early November, mid-November. So those are some good herbicide recommendations for switchgrass. All right, we got another question that came in on Facebook Live, so I appreciate the question. This is from Matt Walsh. Are there cost share incentive programs to help people do these plantings? Absolutely. So if you're interested, and I'm going to go ahead and just drop it in the comments section right now, but I just put a link in the comment section, and that link is to a website that we have that provides you with contact information for professionals that work in your county. That could be people that work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which they manage programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. Both of those programs are cost share programs, and they can provide, not only can they provide cost share to help you get these to help create better habitat for wildlife, but they can also provide technical recommendations and come out and do site visits and things like that. So NRCS is a good contact to have, and they're listed by county on that website. Also on that website, they're going to be DNR, district biologists, and they work with private landowners to create habitat management plans and help landowners wade through these programs. And then also Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, there's some biologists that work, and a lot of their job is working with private landowners to help them create better habitat on their property. So there's the federal programs, which are Conservation Reserve Program and Environmental Quality Incentive Program to help landowners, cost share programs. There's also some state level programs that you can find on the DNR's website, DNR Fish and Wildlife's website. Some of those are, they have a game bird habitat program, but also a program called GGS, which is Game Birds and Grasslands Songbirds, which is a program to help landowners create habitat for those species on their property. So good question. There's a lot of cost share incentive programs for private landowners, and you can find the people to contact about those programs on that website in there. Also, second question from Matt is, can fire and controlled burning be used in place of herbicide? Absolutely. Fire is probably one of the best ways to manage these native grass stands, and that's a common recommendation is to use fire. And that's because these native grasses, if you think about the prairies of kind of western Indiana and Illinois and farther west, they evolved with fire and they were burned pretty regularly every couple of years or so. So they're adapted to fire, and so fire is a really important tool that we can use that helps manage these stands. And so it's really important to use fire. There's also other tools you can use, things like disking. Herbicide, of course, is one of them. Grazing could be another one. And then those are all tools you can use. A lot of times it's just going to take multiple tools to help you manage these. For example, if we burn a native grass stand, especially if it has tall native grasses, if we burn it in March continually, we're going to get more and more native grasses. We're going to lose some of our forb component. So we may need to think about, are there other tools that we can use to increase the amount of forbs, or maybe we just need to change the time of year that we burn. So if we burn in August or September, we can actually do a good job at increasing the amount of forbs or wildflowers in a stand as opposed to burning in March. So good questions, Matt. Appreciate them. Hopefully those helped answer them. Again, if you have any more questions, feel free to ask away and we'll try to answer them. I think I got one or two more here that were asked beforehand that I can go through. Hopefully we'll have some more in the comments. Let's see here. We've got another question about getting started using native plants in landscaping. So a lot of things we've talked about already apply to landscaping as well. So you want to make sure you have a good prepared site. You want to make sure that the species that you select to plant are appropriate for the site. Oh, there's my dog yawning there. Sorry about that. Make sure that the plants are appropriate for the site, and make sure that they're established well. But generally, if we're talking about landscaping plants, we're talking about starting from plugs rather than seed. We can start from seed. I actually have some seed back there in those bins by the window that I'm germinating right now to be planted in my landscaping. And I just killed some of my turf grass in my yard and spread seed in my yard to create a native grass planting where I used to have fescue and turf grasses like Kentucky bluegrass. So a lot of options for using native plants in landscaping as well. I believe that's all the questions that we had that were submitted. So if I don't see any more questions from the comment box. So I appreciate everybody's time and joining in and listening in as we talked about establishing native grasses and forests for wildlife. So just kind of a couple takeaways to take with you as you leave is, first and foremost, is think about what you're trying to achieve by planting these native grasses and forests. What are your objectives? What wildlife species are you interested in managing for? What other goals are you trying to achieve, maybe pollinators or something else? Also think about, do you need to plant? Is there ways that you can increase the quality of habitat on your property? Quality of habitat on your property without planting. So maybe it's by removing the existing cool season grasses and allowing that seed bank to respond. So that's a really cost-effective and efficient way to do it. But also think about all the steps that are involved in the planting process. And it's not going to occur overnight. Generally, it's going to take 2 to 3 growing seasons for you to get really good results. But that doesn't mean that it's not providing habitat for wildlife in the meantime. You just may not see some of the things you plant for at least a growing season. So it's a process. It's not an overnight event. And lastly, there's a lot of really good resources out there to help you answer questions you might have. I couldn't cover it all tonight. There's a lot of really good resources, whether that's publications or videos, and I'll try to add some into the comments here, but also really good resources or people for you to reach out to that are free for you to use. Things like your district biologist, as well as Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever biologists. And there's also private consultants too that do a lot of this habitat work. So asking questions and reaching out to those folks can be a really good way to get started, especially if you don't have a lot of background in this. So I'm going to post a lot of those resources in the comment box there. But with that, I appreciate everybody joining in tonight. We hope to have some more of these. So if you have any questions about other habitat related topics for wildlife, please drop them in the comments and things like that, and we'll try to answer them in later episodes of this. So again, I'm Jared Brook, and I appreciate everybody joining today.